My guest today is Markus Brunnermeier. Markus is a professor of economics at Princeton University and an advisor to institutions including the Bundesbank and the US Congressional Budget Office. With a PhD from the London School of Economics, his research focuses on the intersection between financial markets and macroeconomics, with a special emphasis on inflation, financial stability, asset bubbles, and liquidity crisis. He is the author of several books, including a definitive account of the euro crisis, the euro, and the battle of ideas. In the recent decision of the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe that has put in question both the operations of ECB and the proportionality of what it's doing. I guess for our listeners, we would say the cost-benefit analysis of what they're doing, and also the decisions of the European Court of Justice concerning those programs, dealing a double blow to Europe from Karlsruhe, both to the independence of the European Central Bank and to the supremacy of the European legal order. That would be my view at the very least. What's your view, Markus, on how much this ruling is going to potentially affect the effectiveness and independence of monetary policy in the future? And how do you analyze this ruling?
The way I see it, I think in the long run, it will mostly be handled by the German government and the German parliament. So the ruling essentially says the German parliament and the German government has to respond to that, and probably will drag in the Bundesbank as well. And the ECB essentially stated already they are on top of it, and they are really, responsible to the European Court of Justice rather than a German court. In this sense, I don't think it will have a very long-lasting impact. What's very, very important is that the ECB maintains its independence, and that's a very German principle to put in place with the Maastricht Treaty, that the ECB is very independent. It's the most independent central bank in the world because it's based on an international treaty. It's not a law you can change at any moment. And that's, I think, that's very important. And this court ruling calls this a little bit in question, but I think the ECB essentially has to fight back on that. And I did already in a very clever way, in my view. So I don't think it will be very influential in the long run. It will be dealt with. And it was also one of the motivation of Angela Merkel to push the German-French plan forward for the big fiscal thing. So in this sense, it had a positive input that to say, okay, we have to get a little bit the ECB out line of fire. We have to do more on the fiscal side. And that triggered then this huge innovation on the fiscal side. And that's what we wanted all the time, in a sense that we have more on the fiscal side, more on the bank regulation side. Not everything is on the monetary policy side.
So in that sense, you do see a good upside of that ruling in that sense.
I see a good upside in this ruling. I think it's good to clarify this, and there will be perhaps some changes in the communication of the ECB to be a little bit more clearer. I think they are pretty clear and very transparent already, but on the margins you can improve something here and there. I think what's important is that Germany is very strong on independence of central bank, that this remains. And sometimes if you have an independent central bank, you might not always like what an independent central bank does. That's what independence means. But I think what's also very important that the ECB communicates in a way that you don't lose the German public. You don't estrange from the German public. I think that's a big challenge for the ECB, but it has nothing to do really with this particular court ruling. I think it's very important that you connect, that the Germans see the ECB is our central bank.
People like, when you talk about independence, people like Turner and others have been worrying about can central banks preserve their independence and their legitimacy once they're not just doing monetary policy, but they're basically determining the price of risk throughout the entire economy, lending governments, lending corporates, deciding this corporate survives because I'm going to lend it to it or allow it to be used as collateral, etc. This other corporate doesn't survive. How do you see this independence in a context where banks are doing much more than just thinking about inflation?
No, I think there's a good point to be made, and that's also very consistent with the German way of thinking. You have a very clear mandate, it's very clear, and you enjoy independence. Once you go beyond your mandate in other territories, then you might lose, or you have the danger of losing your independence because you go into territories which are more fiscal or which are more, with other goals. And that requires a very clear justification that we go beyond that. And that's why I think it's very good that the fiscal side or the government step forward to do something on their own and help the ECB to stay within their mandate more easily.
So you've written, Markus, about banks, about financial dominance, about the fact that banks do have these incentives to become too weak. Then they have the ear of the exchequer, of the finance minister, who, when things go bad, always has to call the bankers, and the bankers always have a very good line to make sure that whatever happens, they are not ending up too badly off. How is this financial dominance playing in this crisis, and what should we do to make sure that the interest of the citizens come first?
So let me just put in the context. There in the literature, there's this fiscal dominance versus monetary dominance, which is, who is in the driver's seat, the central bank, the ECB, or is it the national government? And there's always a game of chicken going on between the two. But what I argue, there's a third player, which are the financial sector, and they might also have a huge influence, and might be part of this game of chicken between the government and the central bank. And what one should do is that the financial sector has to some extent an incentive to pay out dividends early, because as I said earlier, the government has an incentive, if there's a lot of extra buffer in the financial sector, to push losses onto the financial sector, like having this mortgage moratoriums or other initiatives. You push it on the financial sector. So the financial sector, recognizing this, they say, okay, let's pay out the dividends and bring the dividends, into safety. And then we are weaker, then nobody can push losses onto us. And so the first measure you should do as a government is say, okay, no more dividends. Like in the US, it means you have much tighter stress tests, and because of the stress test, you're not allowed to pay out any dividends anymore. So this should be done already now. So dividend payments, and that also includes bonus payments. They should be limited already at this point to make sure that the buffer stays strong. And there will be hiccups down the road. And now we have to make sure that don't weaken, or that strategically don't weaken themselves, so that we don't have the buffers, and then the taxpayers to jump in to help them out.
So that's I mean, from the economics committee, we've been calling for that, and I think the ECB and the SSM have been, at least they've been recommending and requiring. I think the banks have been more careful this time than the previous time in decapitalizing themselves. So I would like to take now a broader and a little bit longer term picture. When we look at inflation over longer periods of time, what we see, and what you have pointed out and others, is that, I mean, the fiscal side of things matters a lot. I mean, there was hyperinflation in the 20s because there was an hugely excessive debt buildup over the First World War and the reparations and all that period. Now, nobody's worried about inflation. Everybody thinks, well, it's a deflationary shock. Nobody's going out to shop. Nobody goes to the restaurant. So nobody's consuming. So we're going to face deflation for the foreseeable future. But history tells us that there must be inflationary risks. And many people say, well, if inflation returns, not such a big deal, we'll raise interest rates a little bit. There are two things to me that limit our ability to raise, or central bank's abilities to raise interest rates just a little bit, which are the financial system is really hooked on these very low rates. So if you raise interest rates a little bit, the whole financial system is going to put a lot of pressure to revert. And states, governments are hooked on these very low rates. So it might not be so easy to soak excessive inflation very fast. What's your view on whether there is a risk or not? How sanguine are you about this being just, okay, it's a deflation shock, don't worry?
I think, so it's indeed the case that in the short term and in medium term, we have more disinflation risk or very low inflation risk. But then later on, we might higher inflation risk, or I call it this inflation whipsaw, or it might change then. And then what's really important is you need, let me compare the ECB with a race car, okay? You need a car which has good accelerators, but also very good brakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now you have to put the accelerator on, but you can put the accelerator on because you have the brakes. When the next curve comes, you can slow down again. And one of these brakes is, of course, the independence of the central bank. So you have to protect independence such that you can put on the brakes. At this point, it's very easy to put all the programs, but then it becomes very unpopular when you put the brakes on. And that's when you need essentially the independence. And that's, I think one should prepare already now for this potential possibility that down the road we have inflation pressures. And as you said, it will be very, we might not have to raise interest rates a lot, and it creates already a lot of problems. So the fine tuning will be very, very delicate at that stage. And we have to be essentially preparing for this and have a monetary framework which takes all of these things into account, in particular the financial stability and the sovereign debt issues if you hike interest rates. What really matters is indeed the real interest rate, not the nominal one. So if inflation goes up and the real interest rate stays low, the states and the governments will be able to handle that because tax revenue is growing at a faster rate if it comes. So that's what matters. But you have, if I may say so, some tailored principle. In order to get inflation down, you have to bring actually the interest rate up more than inflation. That means the real interest rate would go up, and that would kill. That would actually, not kill, but would slow down the economy significantly once you want to control this.